So, they're passing out the sheets. I don't think we have quite enough, so some people will share. If you don't get one, I apologize. So let's talk really quick about what we're doing, and then I'll introduce our speaker. During Lent, our church has had a practice the last 4 years of doing small groups during Lent as a way of connecting people to each other and learning something new. And also, I find if I say, hey, I want you to do something for a year, people in the church look at me like, I can't do that. I'm like, you give me 6 weeks, 7 weeks, or whatever it ends up being, and they're like, all right, I can do that. So we do these series of small groups. This year we're doing them on the 7 I am statements from the Gospel of John. And those statements are all based on one passage from John where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, which is then referencing an encounter that Moses had with God in Exodus. And so I thought as a way of launching our Lenten study, we would have a class on that Exodus encounter. And then I said, if I'm going to have anybody teach that, who's the person who would know that the best? And so I invited my friend Rabbi Joel Fleekop to come and speak to us. And in a wonderful God circumstance, he doesn't have anything going on at the temple today because of the 3-day weekend. So it worked out just great for everybody. And he's here. Now I want to say a quick word about Joel. This community is blessed to have him here. He is not only a wonderful leader for the temple and the Jewish community, he is a wonderful leader in this city, and one of the people in this community that I trust the most. Our congregations are similar in a lot of ways, so we can commiserate and tell stories, and as well as that, and built a friendship over the last 6 years as well. So, Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you again for having me. It's great to be back with you. Before I begin, I just want to say that I parked on the other side of Palafox Street, so I'm using a Methodist parking spot, not So whenever we talk about God, and Jews, we just don't talk about God that often, but when we do, it's always complicated. The 12th century rabbi, physician, philosopher Maimonides, also known as Rambam, taught in his philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed, that whenever we talk about God, and more importantly, whenever the Bible talks about God, it's doing so in the language of human beings. It's speaking in a way so that we can understand it, but in so doing, it's relying on metaphor, or you might even go as far as say like a distortion. I once had a high school science teacher who told me that in order for me to teach you, the basics of, I think it was chemistry or physics, I have to kind of lie to you a little bit. Meaning that if I were to explain all the details of all this stuff, it would just be too much. And so we have to simplify it a little bit. But that said, I'd like to take a look at 2 passages from Exodus 3, where God identifies God's self. And so those of you who have a copy, and I apologize if I didn't bring enough, this is just a Hebrew-English translation. This is the Jewish Publication Society's translation. It's kind of the most popular Jewish translation. Because, of course, every translation is a commentary. And I just wanted to expose you to this, and I'll give you other options as we get into some of the specific texts as well. But if it's not exactly what you're used to, that's why. So the first verse I want to focus on is, I'll try to keep an eye on the clock, is from verse 6. So here God, as Moses encountered the bush, and God identifies God's self, saying, Vayomer Anochi Elohei Avicha, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. Vayaster Moshe Panav Ki Yireh Mahabit El HaElohim. And God continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So it starts with this phrase, Anochi, I am. Or really, Anochi is kind of like the fancy Hebrew word for I. Ani is the more common one, the one that's used today in modern Hebrew. But Anochi, I, and this is important, there is no present tense verb for to be in Hebrew. So I, God, right? I am God. The am is understood. Because we're going to come back to that verb in a little bit later. So I am the God of your ancestors or your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, right? So that I am phrase, that's very characteristic of God's communication with the patriarchs in Genesis. Just a couple examples. In Genesis 15:7, I am the Eternal who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans. Or when God speaks to Jacob at Beit El, in Genesis 28, I am the Eternal, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. And there's many other examples. And it's noteworthy that this sort of I am statement is also found in other ancient Near Eastern religions. That when we look at their religious texts, that gods often introduce themselves, and it denotes a closeness or a special intimacy. So religions change, right? But the religious expressions tend to change slower. So this I am is sort of a very common way of God identifying God's self. At least in a closed situation. I think there's more to it than just, this is how gods in the ancient Near East identify themselves, or how God would. So Nahum Sarna, in his commentary on Exodus, asks us to think about how much this particular introduction would have meant to Moses at that moment. So Moses, of course, grew up in the Egyptian royal palace. And he identifies with the people's sufferings, but he's not sure where he fits in the group. Right? And so for God to say this is sort of a jolting him into acknowledgement of his true identity. I'm the God of your ancestors, the God of these other people, right? That you kind of knew about, grew up around, but not with. But you're part of them. And so there's this statement about God is also about a statement for Moses in terms of his own identity. That phrase, Avicha, your ancestors or your fathers. And this phrase becomes, it's repeated several times, including in verse 15 of our chapter today. And then again a little bit differently in 3:16. But it has a lasting effect. So today, in Jewish worship, during the central prayer, we call it the Amidah, the standing prayer, or sometimes it's just called Hat Tefillah, the prayer, right? So our main central prayer, the first blessing begins by identifying God in this way, by Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov. And in Reform and now conservative traditions, we add the matriarchs, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And so we quote this verse, or we reference this verse and others like it in our worship, traditionally 3 times a day. So it becomes an important way of identifying God. And on one hand, I think it speaks to the religious tradition that how we understand God is informed by who our ancestors were, right? So some of us have chosen our church or our religious tradition, but even if we are new to our specific religious community, our notions of God are, of course, informed by the relationship that our parents or our grandparents had with God. Right? That's one of the really special things about religion is it becomes especially in our transitory society, something that helps bind and link generations. So there's that element. But there's also an interesting phrasing, right? So you could just say, God could have just said, Vayomer Anochi Elohei Avicha, Elohei Avraham Yitzhak v'Yaakov. I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's how we normally would talk. But it doesn't say that. It says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So why break it all out, right? Right? When you introduce yourselves, I am the father of Yael and the father of Maya. That's not how I introduce myself. I'm Yael and Maya's dad, right? And so some of the commentaries highlight the fact that, yes, it's one God, but the way that God is experienced by Abraham is different than the way that Isaac experienced God, which is different than the way that Jacob experiences God. Maybe that their needs are different, their experiences are different, and so they each encounter God in their own way. One God, each of us kind of experiencing or knowing God in a unique, personal way. And that's to have that in this text is a pretty broad, powerful acknowledgement, perhaps. My favorite poet is an Israeli secular poet named Yehuda Amichai. He passed right around the year 2000. And he's very irreverent, but also very profound. And so he writes in one of his poems, his last collection of poems is called Open, Closed, Open. It's kind of like a requiem. It's his reflecting back on his life. But he writes, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, I believe with perfect faith that prayer preceded God. Prayer created God. God created human beings. Human beings create prayers that create the God that creates human beings. And in all of that roundabout, right, is that our prayers, our longings, our hopes inform how we understand God, right, and our experiences. And God and our understanding of God informs for us what it means to be human. Which of course then informs our prayers and longings and hopes, which then circles back around. So that we each have our own beliefs about God. And that, but how each of us individually experiences that God is going to be unique. And that maybe there's a hint of that in this verse, or at least there's space in this verse. So highlight that. So any questions on this verse before we go any further? I want to be sure to leave time for questions at the end too. Verse 6. Yeah. Can ask about other verses too. I might not be. Yeah.
In your opening statement, you said something really grabbed me. All translations are.
Yeah. Right. Like, so even in the sheet that I gave you, it says fathers and then it's in parentheses house. And I leave that out because it's not really there. Right? It's kind of, maybe it's implied, right? Because he's giving you this ancestors. But, yeah, I mean, so much of, we don't need to get bogged down in it, but, right, so when we choose how to interpret a word this way or that way, and we're going to really see that on the next verse we focus on, it can make a huge difference. And sometimes Jewish translations budget, and they just don't translate it at all. They just write out the Hebrew and English letters or whatever. And we're going to see that in a second. If I'm not mistaken, I think there might have even been some wars in Europe fought over translations. We're close to it. All right. So let's jump ahead to verses 13 through 15. I think this is the section, if I'm not mistaken, that the Gospel of John was mostly referencing. I did a little bit of learning on this. Not something I'm familiar with. But so Moses said to God, "When I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is God's name? What shall I say to them?' And God said to Moses," and this is how the JPS translates it, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh." It just keeps the Hebrew. Continuing, "Thus shall you say to the Israelites, 'Ehyeh sent me to you.' And God said further to Moses, 'Thus shall you speak to the Israelites, Adonai,' or the Eternal, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever, my appellation for all eternity." So I'm going to read verse 14 for you so you can hear the Hebrew. Vayomer Elohim el Moshe. So God said to Moses, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh." And in the JPS translation, just keeps it right as Ehyeh asher ehyeh, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. So that's God's, according to this text, right? How should I call them? How should I tell them their name? So this is one of the most debated phrases in the Bible on how to understand or translate. So to back up, why do they want to know God's name? Right? And in Egyptian magic, we know from Egyptian texts, we have a lot of Egyptian texts and preserved, we know that knowing a god's true name was a form of power. That if you could name God, if you know God's name, you could know God's true essence and use that name to force or coerce that God to act. So having a name is a form of power, right? And we also see that in Genesis, right? When God gives Adam, that first human being, the power to name the animals, that is a form of power and of knowing. And so when Moses says, "What should I tell them," right? That your name is, and God responds, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh." So we don't really know much about that. What we do know is that it's based off the Hebrew verb to be, right? Lihiot. So Ehyeh is "I will be," right? So some of the translations that are popular, and I didn't have a chance to look up Christian translations, but "I am that I am," "I will be that I will be." Everett Fox, in his beautiful translation of the first 5 books of the Bible, writes, "I will be there." And in the footnote, he explains that 4 times during the commissioning of Moses in chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus, Moses voices concerns, or he voices concerns 5 times about being the leader. And God responds with the word Ehyeh 4 times, including in verse 12, which we have here. Vayomer ki Ehyeh imach. And God said, "I will be with you," or "I will be there with you." So this is this sort of future tense existence, right? That's what we get out of this name, but it's not very defined. In their commentaries, Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig take this word Ehyeh and they connect it to the Tetragrammaton, which in Jewish tradition we pronounce Adonai. There's none of those letters in that word. It's the 4 letters, Hebrew letters Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, which are actually the Vav and the Yud are sort of interchangeable. The 4 letters of that you will be. So what does God call God's self? God calls God's self, "I will be." And what do the Jews, or the ancient Israelites call God, they call God, you will be. Right? Right, and we see that just in the immediate next verse, in verse 15. And God said further to Moses, thus shall you speak to the Israelites, Adonai, right? Or in this case, Yud He Vav He, right? So, some newer translations, for a long time we always translated that as the Lord. Just as a way of marking that unpronounceable name of God. And so in our prayers too, when we encounter that, we say, Adonai, my Lord. But some newer translations render it the eternal, based off that verb of a future tense, being. So thus shall you speak to the Israelites. Yud He Vav He, which Bob Moulton was asking me earlier about, like the word Yahweh, right? That's coming from an attempt to pronounce these four letters, or in English, Jehovah. These are efforts at vocalizing these four letters. Adonai, the God of your father's house, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. And this shall be my name forever. This shall be my appellation. I don't love that translation. The word there, Ze Zichri Lidor Vador. This is my memory. The word Zecher is about memory. This is the way that you'll remember me, or the way you'll be, it's not even just memory, it's the way you'll be mindful and act in the world because of this memory. So, in the Ten Commandments, we have a similar introduction, right? God says at the very beginning, in verse 2 of Exodus 20, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am your God, right? Or I am the Eternal who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You don't have that there. But I am God, right? In this case, I am the Eternal. So what is this new name? We have Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh. And then we have Adonai, or Yud He Vav He, right? There's the four Hebrew letters. The fancy term is the Tetragrammaton. So what do we make of this Tetragrammaton? Rashi says, so Rashi was a 11th century, 12th century, I think 11th century French rabbi. He was also a vintner. And he teaches that this word, this name for God, the Tetragrammaton, this promise of future tenseness, is about God as a promise keeper. And he bases it on Exodus 6, 2 and 3. When God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yud He Vav He, I am the Eternal. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yud He Vav He. So what does this mean, right? So if you go back into Genesis, you'll be like, oh, but we found that name for God many, many times. So what is this statement here? And Rashi says that what's being revealed is the aspect of God as one who fulfills promises. That in Genesis, God makes many, many promises in the covenant. And now with the Exodus from Egypt, what we're starting to have is a God who's fulfilling those promises. And so we have these two different names, and or two different ways of identifying God. One that's looking backwards to the relationship of our ancestors. And then the other, which is whether in verse 14 or 15, Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh, or the more common Adonai or Yud He Vav He, looking forward. And so again, that leads to that translation of the eternal often. Questions? I'm sure there's questions. Yeah, Father Michael.
I've heard this a million ways, so I'm curious your
Yeah.
Why don't you pronounce those 4 letters? Like, where's that stem from?
Yeah, so tradition says that this is that the proper name of God was only uttered once a year by the high priest. So this is during the times of the first and second temple, on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would go after a week's long ritual of purifying themselves and meditation and so on and so forth, that they would go, and then as part of this ritual they would utter that name once a year. But with the destruction of the temple, and it was sort of said in private still, to call upon God, right? Because I often look at religion sort of anthropologically, right? Like, so in Egyptian tradition, right, you use the proper name to get God to do stuff. And what do you want on Yom Kippur? We really, really, really want God to forgive us. And so we're going to pull in this special power and make, or sort of encourage God by using God's proper name, right, to help us out and forgive us on this day. And then with the destruction of the temple, that name was no longer ever pronounced and sort of, we'd say, lost to history. Yeah.
When the temple was rebuilt,
Yeah.
maybe repeat it again.
I don't worry about what's going to happen when the temple is rebuilt. Yes. There's a lot more things to worry about before we get there. I mean, in general, that's Jewish approach to eschatology anyway, that much more focused on all the stuff we have to do right now than what's going to happen to us either after we die or in the times of the Messianic age. Yeah.
Well, if naming the animals is the act of having power over them, then is using the name of God an assumption of having power over God?
Well, it may have been part of the intent. So there's some who speculate that God purposely responds with a super vague name. Right? So, vague name, right? That instead of giving God, if God had a proper name, right? And again, we're definitely speaking in the language of and the experience of human beings. But if God has a proper name, God is reluctant to give that name because it may have been, even if it didn't actually give power, it may have been perceived as giving power because that's how they understood the world around them. And so God says, who am I? I will be what I will be. Right? And it's maybe evading a little bit the question. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of like when God had Adam name all the creatures, he was giving them dominion of the
Right.
creatures, right? Renaming God is assuming,
Right.
risking trying to take dominion over him.
Right.
But we didn't give God that name, right? God gave us that's
That
the
name,
difference. Like,
yes.
You see a pig and name a pig, you have power to decide how that pig's going to be called. We didn't name God. God named God's self.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Adonai means Lord.
So right. So when you like address a letter, like a formal letter in Hebrew, you would say like Adon Schwartz, like Mr. Schwartz, like, and Adoni, the ending E is like mine. So it becomes my Lord, right? And it's really just a placeholder. It becomes a placeholder in these prayers or in these passages when we're reciting them aloud, because there is this name that we can't use or we don't want to use. Other questions? Right, exactly. So it could be a way of God saying, I'm not a thing, I'm not something that that you're going to understand or grasp in that full way. But I think, to go back to that Rashi commentary and in other sources, it's also a God who is keeping promises as well. That you're going to know me now, but what I am is beyond this experience. I'm also the future, which I think is an important statement. Yeah. Lucky.
It's a very beautiful concept that your tradition God's name. But the tradition is very different than Christian.
Absolutely.
Tradition. So maybe this is a question for you. Why with great reverence your name let's say why is that? Where have we lost it? I don't know if it's a question if it's a rhetorical or something for you, Michael. But
Yeah.
I don't want to take up Joel's
No, it's okay.
really quickly. One, we do keep some of it. So if you read most versions of the Bible, when it says the Lord in the Old Testament, it's doing the same thing that this is doing. In fact, many of them do it all in caps. So the famous one, if you go read the King James Version, there'll be an all in caps, the Lord. That is a placeholder for these 4 letters. So it's not like we're trying to then take those 4 letters and say we understand it fully. What's different? Gosh, that's a whole class.
Yeah.
There is a difference in accessibility through what we believe in the incarnation of Jesus versus some Jewish understandings of God. And I won't speak for him on that, but I think that's where you get the more familiarity comes from that. And we can have a whole day we talk about that. But I don't want to make it seem as if we've completely abandoned that tradition. But then you do have, guide me, O thou great Jehovah, which is a hymn using those 4 letters and just trying to figure out what we think the vowel should be. Because we have lost that sort of, like, we use it in a hymn sort of not flippantly, but without much consideration. So we haven't completely lost it, but we've also lost parts of it.
Yeah, I think, besides not evangelizing, like, there weren't Jewish commercials for God gets us during the Super Bowl, right? Right. It's selling a very different version. Of not just Jewish versus Christian, but a very unique, I would say, 21st century understanding of God. Yeah.
You know that in the Old Testament, Adam walked with God personally, and Jacob wrestled with God, and I think Abraham had God visit him in person.
Yeah.
How did they refer to God?
Yeah, I have to pull up the text. Sometimes it's Elohim, sometimes it's El. So I mentioned, like, religious expression doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? El Shaddai. Some of these are names that Jews and ancient Christians would have used or early Christians would have used for God in Hebrew. Like, El just means God, right? There's no capital or lowercase in Hebrew, but Elohim means gods, but it also just means the one God, right? Like the God that we share. El Shaddai, some of these names were used by surrounding people to refer to their deities as well, and they get all sort of subsumed into the idea of what becomes the Jewish and then, by extension, the beginning of the Christian God, or understanding of God, I should say. Yeah, Bob?
Going back to the name, we don't use.
Right. Yeah. We understand that actually referring specifically to, like, oaths and vows. But yes, this idea of having reverence for God's name, I think, is a part of a shared tradition. Absolutely. Great. All right. Well, I know you all have worship in a bit, but I wanted to share another poem by Yehuda Amichai from that same collection. This one's even more flippant, but I think it says something important. So, when God packed up and left the country, he left the Torah, or the Bible, with the Jews. They've been looking for him ever since, shouting, "Hey, you forgot something, you forgot." And other people think the shouting is the prayers of the Jews. Since then, they've been combing the Bible for hints of his whereabouts, as it says in Isaiah, "Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. But he is far away." And we can wrestle with the theology and the problematic that, but this image of what are we doing when we're looking in the Bible? Maybe not to give back the Bible to God, but we're searching for hints about God. We're scrubbing this text over and over again for 3,000 plus years, and trying to understand more about God. And it's a really hard search, because we're trying to understand, as I began with Maimonides, the ununderstandable, the unfathomable, something that's so far beyond our capacity. And so we scrub this text and we wrestle with it and we struggle with it, and we bring in speakers and we have series to maybe understand a little bit more about God, because it's the best. That combined with our experiences in the world are the tools we have to know God better, which I think is, for a lot of us, a shared value, a shared goal, to know God better so that we can live as God wants in the world. Something for us to do. Thank you.
Would you be comfortable with just a free question and answer?
Yeah.
We got 7 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so we got 8 minutes, and you got Joel.
All right.
So, does anybody have any question you want to ask? Within reason. Anybody? Got to be careful with my church.
Yeah, can be off topic. Yeah.
Doug?
We see God, both of us see God as kind of all-encompassing without time or without a lot of definition.
Right.
Some traditions see God, some of our own traditions see God with a gender. Shekinah.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes even the Holy Spirit, as in some of our traditions, has been interpreted from a female gender.
Right.
What do you do with that?
So I think we lose a lot. I'll just speak from Jewish tradition because it's more abstract. We don't have any incarnate, right? That's one of the principles of Jewish faith. I think if my definition of God was gendered, and it's really hard for it not to be, my understanding of God to not be gendered because of the language we use and because of language we've used for those 3,000 years, and surrounding societies and their preferences for gendered languages and gendered gods, that we lose a lot. So yes, we call often God is, right, and famously in the Song of the Sea, right, Adonai hu ish milchama. Adonai is a man of war. Adonai is this great warrior. But other places, right, Adonai is Shekinah, is sort of this female essence. Adonai el Rachum v'Chanun. God is the God of compassion. And the word in Hebrew for compassion, Rachum, is related to the word rechem for womb. Like it's a motherly compassion. And so we lose, in my opinion, for me personally, I would lose a lot if my notion of God was strictly gendered. You have not to get another talk, but like what defines gender, right? Gender is by its, in some ways, defined by its, in contrast to other things. And so if God is uniquely singular, then what is God's gender anyway? Right, you have that debate with Adam too, right? That's another topic for another day, but different conceptions of what was that first human being. Is it accurate to call that person man or, male or female, so on and so forth? Yeah.
You alluded, as I heard you, to the reluctance of the Jewish to evangelize.
Yeah.
That's so why.
That's a big question.
You got 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So Jews don't evangelize because we don't. So we're welcoming, and certainly people, many people in our community are Jews by choice, meaning that they've come to the faith as an adult. But we don't believe that if there is a heaven, that it's any easier to get there by being Jewish. That we don't believe that we have a relationship with God. We have a source of wisdom and guidance that informs our lives, but it's not. Embracing Judaism isn't. We don't believe that salvation in that sense of Christianity is required, and so we don't believe in original sin. So if you don't have to be saved, then we believe people are judged on their actions. And so, rather than their beliefs. And so if you're at whatever system of belief you have, if it leads you to act with justice and kindness in the world and to be a good human being, then you're doing very well. The most traditional people would say that Jews are obligated to fulfill 613 commandments, and non-Jews are obligated to fulfill the Noahide laws. And they're judged by that standard. So to have somebody embrace Judaism, it makes it harder in some ways for them to be judged by God, because now they're being judged by all these other rituals and commandments. And so that's also part of the answer. But the basic idea is we don't believe that, again, we don't believe that being Jewish makes it any easier or perhaps harder to get to where you want to go. Yeah.
What is the Jewish view of Jesus? Was he a prophet? Was he?
Great. Okay. Yeah. So what was the Jewish view of Jesus? That's a question that requires more than 3 minutes. No worries. So the short answer, which I don't want anybody to take offense, was Jews don't think that much about Jesus, meaning that it just doesn't occupy a lot of our mental space. Was there a historical figure named Jesus who lived around the year 0 in the Galilee? Probably. Was he a teacher or a rabbi? Did he have a following? Yes. Then the questions of, was he the Messiah? Was he a son of God? The Jewish answer, of course, is no. But it just doesn't occupy that much textual space.
Actually,
Yeah.
a great place to transition. So, one of the things that I value in Joel and I's relationship and some of the work we've done together and some of the organizations we work in together is there's a whole lot that he and I agree on, right? And those things we can walk step by step on. And then there are things that he and I disagree about. So you asked a great question. What do we think about Jesus? He and I disagree about the answer to that question. And on that, we may have a discussion on it, but I can still work and value him in all the ways we are the same. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And so, at the end of the day, I'm not going to convince him, he's not going to convince me on that, but we can sure work together to feed the hungry and fight for justice and ask for more dignity given to other human beings, and also to value people who are different than us. Those are common things that we have in mind. So I think there is sometimes a focus in the world to look at the ways in which there is divergence, and that's the focus. Or you can instead look at all the ways you can walk hand in hand and without whitewashing or ignoring the differences, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying? So you asked a great question, and he and I could get up and say, here's what I think, and that would be different, but there's a whole lot of stuff we agree on.
Don't you think it's about acceptance?
Well, right. So I think that there's issues of acceptance. I think there's the word acceptance. I think can be a little bit. I think it's about mutual respect. I think it's about recognizing. So from our perspective, right, there's very, very important differences between our traditions, right? And nobody is here to say that those aren't there. But that when we can, as Father Michael said, when we can work together and those things that we think really matter. So from my perspective, it doesn't matter if I'm out there feeding the homeless because I'm quoting a verse from Leviticus, and you're out there because you're quoting a verse from John. But that our traditions both call upon us to be out there and help care for those who are most vulnerable or most in need. And how we get there, from my perspective, doesn't really matter. I know that hasn't always been the case in world history, but I think we live in a time where if we can, we're not having a disputation this morning. I'm not here to convince anybody that I'm right or that you're wrong, and vice versa. That to learn from each other, to develop understanding and respect, and then the best way to do that, I think, is by being in community and working together in partnership. So.
Okay, I know there are a couple more questions, but it's time.
Yeah.
Joel, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.